It's time for some trailblazing justice. Zach's here, Julia's here, and we have a special guest this week, Mark Wilson, who is a paralegal with the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Solitary confinement. What is it? How does it work? Why is it used? And is it even legal? This is the first of a 5-part special series we're doing on solitary confinement in Oregon prisons. It's all coming up on Trailblazing Justice. This is Trailblazing Justice, episode 58, recorded Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. Solitary confinement in Oregon. Trailblazing Justice is the weekly podcast where we discuss civil and criminal rights in Oregon and beyond. Trailblazing Justice is a production of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Here's Bobbin.
Welcome to Trailblazing Justice. I'm Bobbin Singh, the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center, and we're back with another episode of Trailblazing Justice. This week, we are going to be talking about solitary, and as always, we're joined by Zach Winston, one of our co-hosts. He's the Director of Policy and Outreach, and Julia Yoshimoto, who's the Director of the Women's Justice Project and Senior Advisor to the Oregon Justice Resource Center. This week, our guest is Mark Wilson. He is a policy associate and paralegal, legal assistant, legal professional within the organization. It's hard to actually put a title to what he does, but we'll talk a little bit more about his background and experience in a second. But we're just excited to have Mark on this podcast to talk about solitary and how it actually looks in the Oregon Department of Corrections. So let's get started. Mark, do you want to just give a quick introduction of who you are and a little bit of background, a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm Mark Wilson, as Bobbin said. I did 37 and a half years for a crime that I committed just after my 18th birthday. I was just released from custody January 9th of this year, in large part due to the tremendous help of attorneys at OJRC in helping me deal with a solitary case that was brought against me, and then some parole board related actions after that. While I was in custody, for the most part, throughout my confinement, I was an inmate legal assistant. That's someone that's officially assigned to work in the law libraries to assist prisoners with accessing the courts to challenge their convictions or conditions of confinement, which may be solitary issues, maybe medical issues, maybe PREA issues, maybe any number of things. Unfortunately, that caused me to be retaliated against by the department a couple of times and be removed from those positions. And in the last case, I was placed in segregation for 120 days. And in both instances, we brought retaliation suits that the department ultimately settled with me. During the time that I wasn't allowed to work as an inmate legal assistant, I continued to work in a capacity that's unofficially helping other prisoners. It's typically called a jailhouse lawyer. It's just prisoners that are trying to help other prisoners access the courts. And so I guess that's probably a good place to start for now, unless you want more.
Yeah, and I met Mark through work that we were doing at OSCI, where he was incarcerated. And as he was working as a legal assistant there. And, while inside, Mark was a tremendous resource to our organization, provided us a lot of insight and help and guidance, and also acted as a leader within the institution and helped coordinate some fairly significant and impactful events that we did with public officials. And we'll talk about some of that stuff probably in another podcast. But one thing we will for sure talk about in a follow-up podcast probably later this month is access to legal resources for people in custody and what legal assistants do or don't do or are allowed to do and not allowed to do, and how that led to your retaliation. For if listeners are interested in learning more about Mark's retaliation case, not squarely the focus of today's conversation. There's a great Huffington Post piece by out there by Jess Schulberg, and if you just Google search Mark Wilson Huffington Post, it'll pop up. It's a fascinating and profoundly disturbing factually speaking, about what happened. It involved a toy phone and a year-long investigation. And then, like you said, the ultimate result was basically a kangaroo court type of hearing in which you were found guilty and then placed into segregation or isolation or solitary. So, you know, because of your experience as a legal assistant, because of your own direct experience of being in solitary, I thought today would be like a really good opportunity for us to explain to people listening and our supporters what solitary looks like, how it actually plays out in the Department of Corrections. We've had a previous conversation about it, but I think your insights will be really helpful. So first, can you explain what is solitary? And we're using the generic term solitary, but when we talk about solitary, what we're really talking about is that practice of putting someone in isolation for prolonged periods of time. So what does that look like in the Department of Corrections or prisons here in Oregon? And what are the various terms that the Department of Correction uses for because they don't use solitary, they use all these other terms.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so it's interesting. They use any term but solitary confinement, and there's a long list of euphemisms that all prison officials use. In fact, I witnessed a prison official on a tour with University of Oregon students and professors actually standing directly in front of our disciplinary segregation unit and tell these visitors that we do not have solitary confinement in Oregon, which is just flat out a lie. I like to tell people that all prison is solitary confinement. It's just some parts of prison are more solitary than others. And in Oregon, there are several different forms of that more solitary confinement. There is a unit called disciplinary segregation, typically known as DSU. That is where someone commits or is accused of committing a rule violation within the prison system, and they were placed in there for a sanction for a period of time. At the time that let me back up. I would say prior to 1990, that was unlimited in disciplinary segregation, and prisoners could be in there for years and years and years. And there was a federal court case, Lemire versus Moss, that resulted in a limitation of that time. And so DOC changed their rules at that point and limited the time you could be in disciplinary segregation to a period of 180 days. At the time that I was
that was back in 1990. They went from unlimited to creating some sort of caps on the amount of time
for disciplinary segregation. And at the time I was in there, that was still the limitation on it.
And just to be clear, like when they say a limitation of a durational limitation, what they're talking about is durational limitation for that particular sanction.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's not.
Well, no, the 180 days was cumulative sanctions couldn't exceed 180 days.
Cumulative sanctions, okay.
And so that was still the case when I was in there in 2021. And as a result of our efforts here at OJRC, sometime after my release, I believe it was in 2022, the department amended their rules to reduce the caps to a maximum of 90 days, which is what it currently is. But going back to the early 90s, when we won the court decision that said there has to be caps on disciplinary segregation, Prison officials found a way around that, as they always do. And although there was a cap on disciplinary segregation, they created what was called the Intensive Management Unit, commonly referred to as IMU. And then they called that a program unit, not a punishment unit. But courts have recognized that IMU is the same as disciplinary segregation, except in the ways that it is worse. And one of the things about IMU is it is indefinite long-term segregation. And you have to program your way out of it, which they play games with how you're able to program your way out of it. They give people packets to work through, and they're only allowed to work through them at a certain pace. So it requires them to stay in there for extended periods of time. Initially, the Oregon State Penitentiary was the first place we had an IMU, and that was in the early 90s. And then, that one, because of the abuses that were occurring in that unit, with guards beating inmates and other abuses, which is typical of IMUs around the country as well. There was a lot of media attention. There was a lot of court attention. They called it the Thunderdome because of how loud it is in the unit. That unit was patterned after Pelican Bay in California, which was one of the first ones in the country, and that was kind of the model for all the states around the United States to create these units, whether they be called IMUs or security housing units or control units, or there's any number of names they put on them, but they're all the same thing. And they are confinement for 23 hours and 50 minutes a day. Typically you get out for 10 minutes a day. Well, in Oregon, 3 days a week to get a shower.
We'll come back to more like what solitary or isolation looks like. But so we have DSU, that's for rule sanctions,
right?
Or violation of rules and sanctions. And then 180-day max up until recently, in which they reduced it down. And then, as I understand it, if you're in DSU, then you can be transferred into IMU. Do you get transferred into IMU directly from just directly, or do you have to go through DSU first before you get to IMU?
Typically, the process is you serve a disciplinary segregation, and at the end of your disciplinary segregation, you are transferred to IMU. And we discovered in my litigation that they actually were attempting to do that, but thankfully our litigation prevented them from going through with that. But that's typically the way they do it. I understand. So they created the IMU at OSP in the 90s, and then later created a second one at Snake River Correctional Institution in Eastern Oregon. And then more recently, they converted the one at OSP into a mental health unit, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we only have one IMU now, which is Snake River. My understanding is that you can be placed directly into IMU in an ad seg status where you're under investigation without disciplinary charges, but typically it is a disciplinary violation, and then you are moved.
So you introduced a new term, administration segregation. So what is that? So we have DSU, IMU, and we'll come back to these in just a minute, but so now we have another form of solitary. And again, when we're talking about solitary, is this idea that you're largely restricted to a cell or a confined space, a cell for 20, 23 hours a day, whatever it may be. And you can't move. You're just stuck there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so we'll get into more details about what that looks like. But so administrative segregation, what is that?
So I guess what I would say is if you go back to pre-90s, Oregon had two forms of solitary confinement, disciplinary segregation, and administrative segregation. Now we have four: disciplinary segregation, administrative segregation, IMU, and behavioral health unit. And so we'll talk about those in turn. But administrative segregation has always been the counter to disciplinary segregation. You go to disciplinary segregation for committing a disciplinary rule violation in the prison system. Administrative segregation was they get to put you in there for any reason they want to. There is involuntary administrative segregation where prison officials just decide you present some kind of a threat to the safety and security of the institution. You are too notorious. There's threats against you that your safety is at risk. There's any number of reasons they come up with to involuntarily ad seg someone. There's not enough evidence to find you guilty of a disciplinary violation, but they feel pretty confident that you are guilty. And so they're going to put you in there under investigation indefinitely to kind of figure out if you actually committed this when in fact no investigation's occurring. So there's the involuntary side of that, and then there's the voluntary side of that, where someone can seek protective custody and be placed into administrative segregation if they feel that they are at risk. Unfortunately, what we saw in the 80s in Oregon and across the nation was that prison officials were using administrative segregation to confine inmates who were HIV and AIDS positive, to not let them be in general population. And now that has changed from that population to a lot of the transgender population. They do that all the time in Oregon, but there have been some transgender prisoners that are placed in administrative segregation, quote unquote, for their own protection. And that is a bigger problem outside of Oregon, but it still occurs in Oregon as well. And so administrative segregation is typically solitary confinement without limitation on how long you can be there.
And so the involuntary one, we'll come back to like the processes involved in all of this, but so you have ad seg, which has, like you were saying, basically any reason people could be placed in there. I mean, there has to be a reason on paper, but when you say any reason, what you're saying is there's like a large amount of discretion and ambiguity as to what allows people to be able to be placed in administrative segregation, right?
Yes, prison officials can use any justification they want. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Then you mentioned another one, behavioral health unit. So what is that?
So yeah, about 50% of our prison population is severely mentally ill. They do not receive treatment in prison. The best mentally ill prisoners get in prison is they are controlled with psychotropic medications and other mental health medications. So they just try to basically manage them in a way that they are not disrupting the prison population. As I said, recently the department converted the intensive management unit at OSP into a behavioral health unit, which is long-term, indefinite solitary confinement for severely mentally ill prisoners who are deemed not able to function in the general prison population. So they're in a unit that is designed to be a punitive long-term segregation unit, which all of the research says is detrimental to everyone's mental health, but causes mentally ill prisoners to decompensate. And that leads to self-harm, suicide attempts, and things like that. So it's not an environment for mentally ill prisoners.
It's hard to imagine putting someone in isolation or in that type of environment could have any therapeutic upside. I mean, when we talk about how our prisons and mass incarceration is caging people and warehousing people. I think this is illustrative of that point in the most profound way, right? Because basically what they're doing is just trying to remove people out of sight, out of mind, and make them less of a problem or have less of a impact, both visibly or, behavior, whatever it may be. They just are literally putting people out of sight, out of mind that are problematic or feel problematic or too disruptive for them to deal with.
And
Yeah.
the catch to that too, with the whether it's IMU or the behavioral health unit, in order to get out of those units, you have to do programming, you have to have like a certain mental stability. And because the segregation itself is damaging your mental health, I have talked to people and heard of people at Coffee Creek who just get stuck in that unit. I talked to an individual on Coffee Creek is a little different because they have 6 populations of segregation broken up into 2 units. I'm not exactly sure what designation this person had, but she was going through the packets. The isolation was having such a profound impact on her mental health that she already came into the unit with a severe mental illness, but she would end up committing self-harm. And every time she committed self-harm, she dropped back a level again and she had to start the process again. And it's like she could not see a way that she was going to ever get out of this segregation unit, whatever they designated her as, because of the impact that that isolation had on her mental health.
Yeah, that's a pretty common problem within our prison system.
Yeah, I mean, it really does seem like nonsensical and counterproductive from every aspect, to put people in this cycle that they can't break out of. And we'll talk a little bit more about the harms of solitary. But so you have administrative segregation, disciplinary segregation unit, intensive management unit, behavioral health unit. And then I've heard of medical isolation as like another form of solitary. Is that true? Or
I've heard of it as well. I have not had any experience with it, and I don't know the conditions. It doesn't seem, in my experience of time at the prisons I've been at, that it's been widely used. But I mean, by its name, I'm assuming it's related to, somebody that has a medical condition that they feel needs to be segregated from the population. And, I mean, I don't know how long that's going to be. I guess it's going to be contingent on the condition, but I don't have enough information on that to share anything with you on it.
Coffee Creek does have a medical, I don't know what they term it, but a medical isolation unit. And I've had a client who would get stuck in there, and it was difficult for her to get anyone to respond to sort of cries for emergency help because she was so isolated, and it was sort of out of sight, out of mind. We don't want to deal with you. The medical issues are just too much trouble for us. And so we're going to put you in this medical isolation space.
Well, having said that, Julia, I mean, I guess I'm wrong. I mean, I guess I have experienced medical isolation because when we were going through COVID in 2020, I came down with COVID, as did most of our population at OSCI, and they had us isolated in our cells at first, but then came and cuffed us up and transferred us to Coffee Creek and put us in a unit there at Coffee Creek that was essentially, I mean, we were in our cells 23 hours a day, so it's essentially solitary confinement until we were no longer deemed infectious to the population. So yeah, I guess so I was there for 14 days for my COVID condition. Others were there for 30 plus. So yeah, that is another form of it that I hadn't thought about.
Yeah, I mean, from our litigation in COVID during witness interviews, what we had heard as, and I think even anecdotally, you explained this to us too, Mark, people wouldn't share their symptoms of COVID or want to be tested because they didn't want to be removed and isolated.
Yep.
And so, when they're talking about, the population that tested positive, it was a severe undercount because people weren't wanting to be
Absolutely.
report because of that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
So other forms of isolation, one of the things, and I'll ask you if there's any others, but one of the other ones that has come up more recently for us, that's not been in sort of the traditional sort of realm or world of solitary, is what DOC calls modified operations. We term it lockdown.
Yeah.
They talk about it in the sense of as if it's just like a minor inconvenience or whatever it may be, but lockdowns are happening more frequently where people are being basically locked in their cells for long durational periods, randomly and arbitrarily because of staff shortages mainly, and probably other reasons. We heard from DOC's hearing that it's because they're doing events and staff have to be reallocated to those events, and so that way they have to put prisons on modified operations in order to have the staff be able to go out and attend, like what they're saying, spring celebration or the powwow or any type of big gathering that they may have. So it's like they're blaming pro-social events to harm this other population, basically. But what we're hearing, and Julia may be able to speak to this with her clients, but were lockdowns frequent at OSCI?
Lockdowns were not, but that modified operation you're talking about was very frequent, pretty much every weekend, especially when the weather was nice and guards decided to call in because they wanted to have a nice weekend. They would cancel yard for us. They would cancel other outside the unit activities, where the housing unit where I was at, you could get out and move around your housing unit. But most of the housing units there, that was locked down in their cells all that time because those other housing units did not allow outside the unit or outside the cell activities in the unit. So other than the incentive housing units, which is the best housing that is available in the prison system, everybody would experience that as you're stuck in your cell as the guards decide to take the day off and there's not enough staff to run the institution. And so, yeah, and like you say, the pro-social events, if there's a parenting event in the visiting room that involves 20 inmates and they decide they need, X number of staff there, they just shut down all activities and use the program as an excuse, which of course creates resentment in the prison population toward the inmates that are the small number of inmates that are at these different events, because everybody else is suffering from it as a result.
When I heard DOC explain this at the hearing and the way they were explaining it, like in the way of like, well, we're doing all this other good stuff, so we have to essentially lock these people or restrict the movement or access or lock people in their cells for the day. It seems so. I would say it was befuddling, the explanation as to and how they were like promoting it as if they're doing it because of this good thing. But we did do a lockdown report. It's on our website under resources. Julia, any comments about lockdowns that you want to add right now?
No, I don't really have much to add to what Mark described. I would say that at Coffee Creek, the women are experiencing lockdowns pretty frequently. And what I hear from them that is the most damaging, I wouldn't say most damaging, but the thing I think we don't think about when it comes to lockdown is that with the lockdowns, they don't know how long it's going to be for. And that really messes with people. And so they describe, the doors opening, they walk out of their cell in the morning, they're told they're on modified operations, are locked down, they turn around, they walk back into their cell, and they don't know when they're going to get out again. And even if they are confined to their unit, they don't have yard time. It just depends so much on the officers that are running the unit. So whether or not they get out for showers, how much time they have to make phone calls, things like that. And one of the women I spoke to said she's just like she called herself a walking depression commercial of symptoms. It is just impacting her mental health so much that it's hard for her to get up out out of bed, like her body hurts. I mean, the depression is just so severe from being on these lockdowns that they don't know when they're going to happen and how long they're going to be for.
And just as a sort of what is it, exclamation point in all this, is that DOC doesn't really track this in any way. So there's no way to really fully understand or appreciate how often, frequent, the duration of these quote unquote modified operations are or lockdowns are. So what we hear is just anecdotal.
DOC is tracking this as of, I think, a year ago or something like that. But when we saw the data that came out of Coffee Creek, it wasn't matching up with what we were hearing and what people were tracking themselves. And it's because of the way they designate certain things as different types of modified operations. So that kind of messes with what you're looking at. You don't know what you're looking at. And then it's just dependent on whether or not people are actually logging it. And so what we hear, like what Mark had mentioned, is weekends are a very common time for lockdowns because administration for the institution are not there on the weekends. So, the data is just not reliable, even though they say that they're tracking it and that they're trying to be transparent.
Yeah. Again, if people who are listening are interested, we do have a report on this that you can read. And you can find it at our website. Mark, any other way in which solitary exists? I mean, I'm sure there are, but more official ways that maybe.
Those are the main ways they normally do it. But I mean, they can do it any way they want to. I mean, the reality. I mean, with any individual, I mean.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I'd really encourage people to think about is not looking at the term that's being used. Is it solitary? Is it using the word isolation? But actually looking at the quality of what's happening. Like, is how the person's being treated and how they're being restricted. And in that way, I think, your sort of construction of it, Mark, saying that prison in itself is solitary, but there are just more solitary sort of manifestations that may exist, or more restrictive manifestations that may exist, like we've talked about. I think that gets more to an accurate definition of what we're talking about, because that's what we need to focus in on, is how people are treated, what their limitations and restrictions are, what they have access to, and so that's what I would really encourage people to pay attention to.
I think the other thing about the different terminologies and designations is it's a way for DOC to do whatever it wants with solitary confinement. And so if a legislator or some state leadership is asking about a specific type of segregation, like disciplinary segregation, thinking that that's the only form of segregation that exists, then there are things that DOC can say about, we've reduced our caps down to 90 days, but they can sort of move their talking points around with the different forms of segregation, and it keeps everything very, very opaque as to what's actually going on with solitary in DOC.
This is a good segue into the next sort of segment of the conversation, where if you can kind of talk about what it looks like, what solitary looks like, and how people get there. But I just want to pause here and this is a rhetorical pop quiz. I know all of you know the answer to this, but just for people to really understand and crystallize this. But solitary, the idea of solitary, using this either for punishment, isolation, whatever it may be, is this a mandate that DOC has? Is this a construction or some sort of punishment or practice that is defined anywhere in the state of Oregon in law or in the Constitution by executive order?
The answer would be no.
No. Yeah. The answer to that is no. So this is really, really important. I think there is no statute on solitary. There is no mandate from the legislature that the Department of Correction actually use solitary or have these different types of solitary confinement practices. There's no statutory definition for administrative segregation, disciplinary seg, IMU, behavioral health. None of this is in statute. The legislature hasn't defined this. They haven't mandated this. The only thing the legislature has said to DOC is essentially, you're in charge of creating policies and practices for the safety and security of the prison. Some general term like that, some general statutory authority.
Well, yeah. And, I mean, the reality is solitary has been a part of prison since we've had prisons.
Right.
And, initially in the 1800s, they placed prisoners in solitary confinement because they thought it would rehabilitate them. And they discovered that it actually caused physical harm and caused people to deteriorate. So they stopped doing it for that reason and went to different models, where we have the models of prison today, where prisoners are out of their cells and engaging with people and that kind of thing, because that previous model was causing harm. But the prisons then said, well, we're still going to use that model for punishment. So we've got the model existing, but not what it was initially intended to be used as.
Yeah. And I think this is an important point, because this is a cultural practice within prisons. This is not anything, all the social science and studies behind solitary, as we've sort of alluded to, conclude that this is damaging, that there's no upside to this in any way, no therapeutic upside, no behavioral upside, nothing. But this is just a practice by prisons. This is wholly a creation of the Department of Corrections. They created all these different types of solitary. They're the ones that have created the rules and policies and practices around solitary, but it's not from any type of behavioral health perspective or rehabilitation sort of behavioral perspective. It's from, I think what you just mentioned, a punitive aspect, like how to punish, and part of that culture and practice of punishing people. And it's just gotten so ingrained as this tradition or this cultural practice that prisons cannot envision themselves not having that tool available to them. Exactly. Even though it adds no benefit, like literally no benefit, to put people in prolonged isolation. But again, the point I'm just wanting to make is this is wholly sort of like a fictional creation of the prison system. And yes. And this can be changed by the prison system if the prison director wants to. The director of the prison can basically say, we don't want to use this practice anymore. It doesn't make sense. It's counter to everything we know, counter to best practices, counter to everything we know about humans and individual behavior. And this makes no sense. The legislature could do it. At any point, the legislature could step in and say, this makes no sense. This is counter to everything that we know, and we're going to require that the DOC at a minimum follow international human rights standards, which is the Mandela rules. Exactly.
Well, and it's important to note that those Mandela rules have said that any time in segregation beyond 15 days constitutes torture. I mean, yeah. The flat out meets the definition of torture, and prison officials say, we're good with doing that. We want to do that.
Well, not only prison officials, but the legislature, the courts, the governor. Anyways, I just wanted to make this quick point. Julia, did you want to add anything?
I was just wondering if Mark could describe what his experience was like in solitary and what he saw other people's experience in solitary, just so people can understand just how punishing this is. And
that's where I wanted to get to. So, Mark, if you could start from like the moment someone is taken from either general population or their cell and moved into an isolation unit, and then sort of what does the solitary units look like? What are the first days, weeks, month in the solitary unit look like or feel like as far as like access and things like that? But, just kind of sequentially, if you can take us to the point of, how do people end up there and what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a big topic. So, in general population, you have, some comforts in prison. You have personal property. You live in a cell with a cell partner that hopefully you've been able to pick and that you get along with, and it's a comfortable space. And the prison clothing that is normally issued to you are like clothing that anybody outside could wear. It's blue jeans and t-shirts and socks and, and tennis shoes and that kind of thing. So when they decide that they're going to put you in segregation, either under investigation or because you've been found guilty of a disciplinary violation, typically what will happen is a group of guards will come to you and surround you, or if you're in your cell, they'll tell you to back up to your bars, put your hands behind your back, and a guard will handcuff you behind the back, and then one guard will take one arm and another guard will take another arm, and they will escort you toward the segregation unit as several other guards follow along with them, in case you act out and they all need to jump on you and subdue you, that kind of thing. As they're escorting you to disciplinary segregation, in most instances, all other prisoners will be told to stop moving, stand on the wall until we pass. You get to the segregation unit, and again, you're still handcuffed, but they then put you in a cage, and then they take the handcuffs off of you when you're in the cage. They do that through an opening in the front of the cage, and then they make you strip. They take off all of your clothes and throw them out to the guards that are outside there, and they then conduct a strip search. And once that's done, they give you a pair of underwear and an oversized jumpsuit and a pair of flip-flop shower shoes, sandal kind of things. And that is the clothing that you will wear the rest of the time that you are in segregation. You're given a blanket and sheets for the bed. And that's it. You don't get any of your property. Your property is bagged up by somebody else, typically a guard, but sometimes they'll have cell mates do that. A lot of times property gets broken and turns up missing. And some of that property is really expensive property that they've charged you for a television or a guitar or different items of property that you're allowed to purchase in the prison system. But the entire time you're in segregation, you do not have access to any of that property. So once they have strip searched you and put you in the jumpsuit, then they handcuff you behind the back again in the cage. When they open the cage, two guards grab you by the arms again. In some units, they'll put a dog leash on you. And those guards will then escort you, physically move you as you walk with them. And in some units, they will also have leg shackles on you, which limit your ability to actually fully walk, and they cut into your ankles with every step. And a lot of times they put the cuffs on tight enough that they cut into your wrists as well. But anyway, they then escort you to whatever cell they've decided you're going to be in. For me, the first cell they decided to put me in was what they called an observation cell. I went into that cell. It had nothing in it. It had no light in it. There was a cement slab that had a mattress on it, and it had a combination toilet sink in there, and there was nothing else in there. It was also under video surveillance 24 hours a day. Why they put me in there, I can speculate. There was no reason. Typically, they put people in there who they say are suicidal, who need to be observed so they don't commit suicide, even though we've had people commit suicide in those cells under observation. So, interesting.
In this observation cell, is there a window? What do the doors look like?
They're solid doors. These ones did have an open window in it. This one I was in, there was typically in the unit I was in, they're bar cells fronts. So When you look down the tier, you'll see bars, and this one has those bars, and then inside the bars had a solid door that they would shut and isolate someone inside of that. And some guards would open the door so you could have some light in that way, and other times they wouldn't open that door. I wasn't in there very long, probably 24 hours, maybe a little bit more than that, before they moved me to a different cell.
Is there any natural light in these cells? Like, is there a window to the outside or anything like that?
So you have the row of cells, which are about 12 cells long in the unit I was in. And then there's a tier, and across the tier is a wall of windows, but they have frosted the windows so you can't see out the windows. You can tell only that it is daytime or nighttime. They also have removed all clocks. You have no sense of time in the segregation unit. That's one of the biggest things that are very difficult for people. And so what I did, and what most people do when you go to segregation, is you immediately make a calendar, because you know what the day is you get in there. So I made a calendar. They sanctioned me to be there for 120 days. So I made a calendar that had 120 days on it. And each day at a particular time that I marked by an event happening, them bringing us meals or mail call, something like that, I knew that it was another day, and I would mark off the day. I also, so you don't get any property in there, but you can get a book off a book cart that they have in there, which is limited. If you have people in the community who can do it for you, you can order a subscription to a newspaper. I did. And part of that was, again, so that I could maintain a connection to the world. I could see what's going on in the world. I can see what the date is on the newspaper. It gave me something meaningful to do. I mean, outside the segregation unit, I probably flipped through that paper in 5 minutes. Inside the unit, I read that paper, every word of that paper, for 3 or 4 hours, did every crossword, every Sudoku puzzle. I mean, that paper was my existence in segregation. So, it's a stimulus restricted environment. You do not have any access to anything other than the 4 walls of that cell, without the things I'm describing.
So you were in the observation unit for 24 hours, and then you're moved into a regular, what would be called like a regular solitary or segregation unit.
Yeah. So, well, it was all the same unit.
Okay.
That
cell
was on one tier, and then they moved me to another tier that had regular cells. And the regular cells were barred fronts. So basically you look at the tier, and there's a row of cells that are solid steel walls, but the front of the cells were barred fronts. And then those barred front to the cells were covered with like a chicken wire, a small gauge wire over the front that would prevent prisoners from passing things from one cell to another. So you don't see anybody except for if you get out of the cell and walk down the tier and can look in the bars of the cell next to you. You won't see people, but you will hear people on the tier. And that is the sole, you have 12 people there. You'll have somebody yelling from one end of the tier to somebody at the other end of the tier. And so it can get really loud in there. I have a lot of mentally ill prisoners in there who are yelling and things like that. So there's constantly noise in those units. But
and by noise, you just mean like people making noise, not was it other noises too?
Yeah, there was a massive exhaust fan in the cell that I was in that sounded like a jet engine that ran from like 10 o'clock at night until 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was really hard for people to sleep because of that. But yeah, there's constant noise in the unit, but it's very difficult to to focus with all the noise.
So you said in the observation cell there wasn't any light, but in the quote unquote regular cell there was a light.
There is a light fixture in those cells, yes.
And that's not something you controlled, right? That's something that
No. There's lights on the tier and lights in the cell that the guards control. And so typically the light is there. So when they walk by at night, they can observe you. They walk by every 30 minutes or something like that to do a quote unquote tier check to see that everybody is alive, I suppose.
So you're in this very sort of sensory deprived environment, notwithstanding some of the noises that you're talking about. And you have in the cell now, you in the normal cell or regular solitary, you have a bed that's on the floor, or is it on a frame now?
It is on a metal frame, and it's just a mattress on a metal frame. So yeah.
And then what do you have access to as far as like hygiene, access to showers?
Yeah.
And how often are you able to get out of the cell, or what do they let you do as far as getting out of your cell?
Yeah, so that was an interesting thing. So of course, in the prison population, you have personal hygiene products that you buy in the prison commissary, toothbrush, toothpaste, shampoo, soap, all that kind of stuff. You don't get any of that when you go to segregation. That gets put in your property. When you get into segregation, you also do not get toothpaste, and you're not allowed to purchase toothpaste or shampoo for at least 30 days. So they're using hygiene products as punishment. So imagine not being able to brush your teeth with toothpaste for 30 days. And I mean, that is how they treat you in this area.
Do they give you anything?
They give you baking soda. And let me see what else. And then there is, for the soap, they have this industrial liquid soap that once a day you can ask for a cup of it that you're allowed to use when you shower. And you're allowed to shower 3 days a week. And you have to say, the guards will come by at breakfast and ask if you want to shower, and you have to sign up for the shower, and then they will come and let you out, which the shower is, they come to the cell, tell you to back up to the bars, they put handcuffs on you, two guards escort you to the shower, they close a metal grate once you're in the shower, and then they uncuff you while you're in the shower, and you're allowed 10 minutes for the shower, and 10 minutes for all activities, which is your shower and any if you wanted to walk afterwards, that kind of thing would encompass the entire 10 minutes. And they would, if you wanted to walk afterwards, they would come back to the shower, they would cuff you again behind the back, then take you to another cage, open that cage, put you in it, and uncuff you. And in that cage, which is kind of a dog run, is what it's like. It's on the tier that you're allowed to pace back and forth in that dog run for that 10-minute period.
So I'll come back to that in just a second. But there was when you were in solitary this last time because of the retaliation. You had also mentioned there's like a community razor or something like that. So you don't get to shave or something. What was that?
Yeah, so the only way you're allowed to shave in the segregation unit is to use a community electric razor that is available on the tier. So you have no control over, who used it before you, how clean it is, how operational it is. In fact, you typically had broken, there's like 3 heads on it, and typically at least one of them was broken. And so, I went for most of the time I was in segregation without shaving. And then instead of shaving, after you're there a certain period of time, once a month, you can request a haircut, and a barber comes into the unit to give you a haircut. So I just waited until I was getting close to release, and just had the barber shave off all the hair that had grown during that time. But yeah, so I mean, there's risk of disease. There's all kinds of issues that come with that community razor. So yeah, I wasn't about to use it.
So you had mentioned sort of exercise or physical activity. So you're in your cell, what sounds like 23 hours a day, maybe even 24 hours a day, depending on whether or not you have a shower. What is the availability of exercise? Or you said there's like that, what you call like the dog walking kind of thing, but was there any opportunity to get fresh air or get outside, or any type of other kind of activity?
After you're in segregation for 30 days, you're supposed to be allowed outside recreation 3 days a week, but that never happens. And that again is guards coming to your cell, handcuffing you behind the back, and then taking you outside and putting you in a cage smaller than your cell that you stand in for, I believe, 40 minutes. Outside, and whatever the elements happen to be. It could be raining or whatever, and you're just in the jumpsuit, right? And so that's supposed to be available to you to request 3 days a week, but was canceled all the time, quote unquote, because they didn't have the staffing available. That's always the excuse they use to deny you these opportunities. And that was even true of letting people out to use the dog walk. They're like, oh, we don't have enough staff here to let you do that. So you can't do that. You can only have a shower this morning.
So you're in your cell anywhere from 23 to 24 hours a day, except for maybe like the 10 minutes you get to shower and walk,
3 days a week.
3 days a week. You had mentioned the newspaper being like one way to keep your mind, uh, to keep your mind focused and grounded and connected to the outside world. I mean, what is it that, well, let me back up. The other people in the solitary unit, you had alluded to the fact that they're mentally ill people and there's sounds coming. What was that environment like? What were the types of, I don't know, what was sort of like the experience of the other people, and how that impacted you and your ability to be able to stay focused or not?
I described it like a monkey cage at the zoo. I mean, all these monkeys in there and going crazy and being really loud and really chaotic. It was always really super, super loud and really hard to focus. And, it's just really difficult for anybody in that environment. But people that are already struggling mentally, that is only going to be, it cause them, stress and trauma. And I mean, it's not a good environment for people to be able to function in a healthy way. A lot of people try to sleep away their time in segregation, which is, I mean, if you can sleep with the noise, great. But I mean, whether you're able to sleep or not, I mean, that's what people, usually are trying to do, is just trying to, other than getting up to eat, when they bring the meals to your cage, and they bring, you get the same food as the prison population, except it's colder and it's on dirty trays, seg trays that they bring to you, plastic trays that they put in the cell. And other than that, they'll bring the breakfast at like 5 a.m. and then lunch will be about 10 o'clock or 10:30, I guess it is, right before count. And then dinner's around 4 o'clock. And so again, these are ways you're marking time. But other than that, people are trying to, make the time pass, by, sleeping when they can, and trying to ignore the noise of the people that are not doing that. Mail is an interesting issue in segregation as well. There's like to talk about at some point.
Yeah, just one last point on this. So if people are having a crisis or in mental health crisis or need help, whether it's for mental health or physical health, what is the access to those types of supports and services when you're in SEG?
Well, they're supposed to be available to everybody in SEG. There's supposed to be mental health counselors that supposedly walk the tier and check in with people, and that did not happen when I was there. In fact, I witnessed prisoners writing what's called kites requests to behavioral counselors, mental health counselors, saying, "I'm feeling anxiety. I'm feeling like I need to talk to someone. I need help." And the responses they were getting back is, "We can't help you while you're in SEG. Kite us when you get out." And so, you know, there was nobody walking the tier and checking in with people. There was no services available to those people.
So I think, as I mentioned, you had mentioned that the newspaper was one way that you kept connected. What are like the strategies, if someone like yourself that was not in a mental health crisis like you've described, perhaps other people who decompensated, what are tactics that you're doing to sort of mitigate that decompensation or to keep yourself stable? Like what are the other things that you would do to help just help make yourself get through that time?
Well, I mean, for the most part, there's nothing meaningful, but like prison generally, you create routine and you try to create routine that has meaning and purpose. For a lot of prisoners that are artists, they spend a lot of time trying to do their art in prison, in segregation with limited supplies. You get an ink pen that is like 4 inches long. Actually, I understand they've taken those away at the unit I was in now, and they are giving them pencils now instead. But they're like golf pencils. They're like, 3 and 4 inches long. But anyway, that's what people get. And then they can get blank paper, or, they have an envelope from mail that came in and they draw on those. For me, it was hard. I mean, I had, somebody order me, a crossword book or something like that. I wrote for Prison Legal News at the time. I hand wrote a couple Prison Legal News articles while I was there. I hand wrote some legal work while I was there. But it was really without the ability to do the legal research, that kind of thing. So it was really difficult to find ways to occupy my time in a meaningful way, which of course makes the time really drag and feel much longer than the 120 days that it actually is.
I know we tried to have, regular legal calls with you just to check in on you, but I know other people at the prison communicated with you. How important is that to have that community and people writing you? And that you had mentioned mail before.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, like the mail, access to mail and stuff like that?
Mail is really important, and I found to be really interesting because there's so much tied to it. Mail would come, like in general prison populations, 6 days a week. There was a particular time of the day that guards would pass out the mail on the tier. And they start at one end of the tier and walk down the tier and stick a letter on the bars of anybody that had a letter on the bars. And so, mail was your only connection to the outside world, and everybody looked forward to mail call. It came after lunch. Everybody stayed up after lunch waiting for mail. And it was an event. I mean, people were really excited, looking forward to mail, hoping to hear from somebody. And then routinely every day, the guard would walk past the cells, and only one or two or three cells would get any mail. And you could feel this depression come over the tier as people felt disappointment of not having anybody contact them. And the whole unit got quiet. And that was the one time of the day it got quiet, where people depressed then went to bed or whatever they did. I mean, they just sat there quietly in their cell. For me, it was hugely important to have people in the real world and people in the prison world remember that I existed. And I mean, they talk about segregation as the hole because you feel like you are in a hole, you are buried, and that you are forgotten. And having people remember you is really important. I have one friend in population. I did 120 days in segregation, and he made a point, which is really remarkable and unheard of that I'm aware of, that he wrote me a letter every other day for the entire 120 days that I was there. I got 63 letters from him, and it was just one page, just checking in. Sometimes he would put a picture in there with it that I would be able to get of, some nature scene or something. Just letting me know that he was thinking about me and that I wasn't forgotten, and telling me what was going on in population. And those letters were a lifeline. It's really rare that you get something like that when you're in segregation, and it's really valuable.
Yeah, it sounds terrible. And, I think even a polished version of a description of something like this makes no sense, as, what you're describing and treating people like this. And the fact that there's different ways to create conditions like this for people, like IMU, ADSEG, DSU, behavioral health is quite disturbing. I mean, you did 120 days, and you had like a very clean discipline record. Like you didn't, except for like the retaliation issues, you really didn't have any issues. But there are people who are, there's the max day that's allowed, but there are people who are cycling in and out of solitary, right? Like,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, they're doing, even though they may not be doing sequentially more than 60 days or 90 days now, or whatever it may be, they're still in that environment for prolonged periods of times, years perhaps, right?
Oh yeah, there were people that cycled in and out of segregation 2 and 3 and 4 times while I was there. And it's always, it's pretty common, that happens.
And part of that, Mark, is the permutations that they can use to get you, right? I mean, it's a shell game sometimes, right? They can continue to shuffle you around to various different areas of types of segregation.
Yeah, and that's one of the ways they get around the cap as well. It's like, okay, we can put you in segregation for 180 days. And so they put you in there for a set period of time and let you out for 24 hours or 48 hours and issue another misconduct report, and then they get to do it all over again.
Right. And which is also the way they get around reporting numbers, right? I mean, I think Julia was talking about that earlier, which is, they can say, for example, that we're no longer going to, use DSU, disciplinary segregation. But they could just stick everyone in administrative segregation,
Yep.
and their numbers look amazing for no one going, for really dismantling the disciplinary segregation unit. But everyone is now just in administrative segregation, and that's why it's a shell game.
And we've seen that happen in states across the nation so far,
Yeah.
doing that very thing. Exactly.
Like our neighbors.
Yep.
So I know for this podcast, we did like a little bit of a planning, and we had a pretty ambitious agenda to talk through a lot of different things, but we are going to do a series on solitary. So we will follow up. And I think what I want to talk about is the legal processes, the administrative processes that allow DOC to put people in segregation. We'll have one of our staff members, Kyle Black, talk about with you, Mark, what solitary was like at Coffee Creek. I want to have a conversation about the Mandela rules, international human rights standards, the social science behind, solitary. So we will have a series of conversations on solitary moving forward and more, podcasts on it. But because, we're at time now or getting near time, just to wrap up, I guess the last sort of questions I have around is what is the reentry process back from solitary into general population like? Like what is that physically like? And then as you mentioned, all your property and things are taken. Where do you end back up? You are obviously, I know you were removed from your position as a legal assistant prior to going into segregation, but what does that look like when you come back just from where you're at in sort of the hierarchy of prison? But I guess start with sort of just like the physical and mental kind of emotional process of reentering back into from a sensory deprived environment back into, prison is a pretty noisy, chaotic environment to begin with. I mean, what is that like?
Yeah, you're right. Prison is uh, really noisy and chaotic and crowded, and you're around. The prison I was at, 900 people. And you're around large groups all the time. Whether it's in the chow hall where there's 300 people at once eating a meal, and it's loud and chaotic and all that. And so, yeah, you go from sensory deprivation back to that just immediately, and it's really overwhelming. It's hard to kind of get used to again, especially if you've been there for a long period of time. And I've seen a lot of prisoners come out of SEG that really struggle with that, and some that say, "I want to go back. I need to get away from this," and that's their only mechanism to get away from it is to kind of find a way back into segregation. So yeah, when I got out, I went in at the highest level in the prison population as far as incentive levels and privileges and movement and activities that I could be participating in, and they stripped me down to the lowest level, and that means that you are restricted in the types of housing you can have, the types of jobs you can have, how much canteen you can purchase, what kind of programs you were eligible for. And so your prison experience is much more difficult. The types of property you can have, that kind of thing. And so it took close to 18 months to actually get everything back to where it was before this happened. And my understanding is one of the things they did after my situation, where they reduced the SEG time down, they decided to increase the amount of time it takes to earn everything back. And so where it took me 18 months, and now it might take somebody 3 years or longer, and it's just another punitive mechanism. It's an unofficial collateral consequence of the punishment regime in the prison system, and it's designed to just break you down and put you at the lowest place where it's hard to have an existence that is meaningful, and it's hard to have enough money to support yourself. I mean, buying personal hygiene products and envelopes to write home and phone calls and that kind of thing already exceed the best paying jobs in prison. And so you're not allowed to have the best paying jobs. And so you can't do all those things. You have to make choices. Do I make a $3 phone call, or do I buy soap or envelopes and paper to write a letter, which is, I mean, that's almost $1 now to write one letter, 88 cents, I think it is, and people just don't have that money. And so then this process makes that even more difficult. Your property, once you finally get it back, I think it took me 3 or 4 days after I was out of segregation to get my property back. Then you get to see what you lost and what got broken. And routinely you'll have, accidentally, it looks like somebody took the lid off your shampoo, and it went all over your papers, and there's all kinds of these little passive aggressive things that people do to take shots at you, and so, and ruin, the few things you have in life.
No, I mean, the way you describe it, it's nothing short than an act of violence against people. It's damaging, it's
Absolutely.
traumatizing. It breaks you. It's meant to break you both
Absolutely.
physically and mentally and emotionally. And
It doesn't make any, I mean, it just, listening to Mark, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because like the whole, whether your focus is staff safety or whether your focus is rehabilitation of the adults in custody, it doesn't accomplish any goal other than satisfying the sadistic punishment tendencies of that generally is found in the United States. It just makes no sense why people would want to continue to carry out a practice that doesn't have any tangible benefits, because it's the easy thing to do, or it's because what's been done historically. It just doesn't make any sense. We don't do that really in many other aspects of life, and it's frustrating, especially when Mark breaks it down.
it's a deeply disturbing indignity, that people suffer through.
Well,
And
it's more than that. Again, it's torture, but
yeah,
I'd like to mention just briefly, I I had the privilege recently to be a part of a screening of a movie at University of Oregon Law School and a panel discussion afterwards. And this documentary is airing on PBS until May 3rd. It's called The Strike. And the panel discussion involved, the movie, I should say, is a movie about solitary confinement in California. And the thing that struck me in being a part of this is I got to meet three of the men who are in the movie who were in the segregation unit in California. And this segregation unit was Pelican Bay, which was the model for our IMU. These men had served 30 and 40 years in solitary confinement. I mean, it's I don't even know how you do that. I mean, I did 120 days and felt like, why am I here with these guys? I mean, it's like, but it's insane that somebody can actually survive that. And these people did, and they're out of prison. And
and that's what they've been identified as survivors of solitary. I mean, that's what
absolutely,
the nomenclature that we use now is survivors of solitary, because it is torture. I mean, it is a form of violence that's being enacted against people. And, this is the thing that, connecting this to what's happening at the federal level, because our organization is involved with thinking about anti-Trump and, this anti-civil rights sort of agenda that's going on, is the fact that we allow these practices to occur at the state level, and that we have normalized this type of treatment of individuals, directly connects to why it's easy for someone like Trump to do the things that he's doing. Because this is, I think it's like you mentioned, this is part of our culture. This is part of the sadistic value system of our country. And unless we change these practices and policies at a local level and say, no, this is no longer allowable, and we're not going to treat people like this, we're not going to be able to change the things that are happening at the national level, because that's just a reflection of who we are. It's not like, and I say that generally as a country, I'm not saying who we are in this podcast. I don't think any of us are like that, but as a country, as our societal values, it's just a reflection of our global values, the values that are sort of embedded in this country. And, that allows for the kinds of things that happen to you, to those guys that did 30 years in solid. I mean, that makes, it's inhumane, like what you described, the 120 days you did, but to say that people are doing in this country 30 years, decades in solitary is.
and there are people in Oregon that are doing extended periods of time as well. I'm not sure what the number is up to, but there's no reason they can't do 30 and 40 years here in Oregon too.
Well, we have to wrap up because we're, I think, at a good 90 minutes now or somewhere around there. And I know, I think Julia was joking, between you and me, Mark, we could talk for hours. So, but any last thoughts you want, just as this introductory conversation on solitary, you'd like people to know?
No, I think it's just a bigger topic that needs more discussion, and I just hope people will care. I mean, the big thing about prisons is it's out of sight and out of mind. I mean, the walls and fences are designed as much to keep people out as it is to keep people in. As long as people aren't looking and asking questions, prison officials get to do whatever they want to do to people inside. And this is what comes of that, and worse. And there's a lot more that we could say about all of this that we're talking about. And I hope that the conversation will continue. And I hope people will start getting involved and doing something about it.
Well, I just want to say how grateful we are to have you part of the team. I mean, you are a part of our team while you're on the inside, but to have you outside and part of our team to help us, advocate against for people and against these types of practices is a tremendous asset to the state and a benefit to, everyone, all Oregonians. So I'm glad we could have this conversation. We will have a new podcast coming out later this week as well. And we'll have more conversations on solitary, so look for that. But check out that movie, The Strike, on PBS. And we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.